violence, terrorist acts, illegal acts constantly. They're both huge nuclear weapon states, and their nuclear armaments are not being considered. And
who exactly are you referring to there?
The United States and Israel, the two major rogue states in the world. I mean, there's a reason why in international polls run by U.S. polling agencies, the main ones, the United States is regarded as the greatest threat to world peace by an overwhelming margin. No other country's even close. Incidentally, it's kind of interesting that the U.S. media refused to publish this, but it doesn't go away.
Well, you don't hold the US President Barack Obama in very high esteem, but does this still make you think of him in slightly better terms? The fact that he is trying to reduce the threat of nuclear war.
Actually, he isn't. He's just initiated a program, a $1 trillion program of modernization of the nuclear weapon system, which means expanding the nuclear weapon system. That's one of the reasons why the famous doomsday clock of the Bulletin of American Scientists has just a couple of weeks ago been pushed 2 minutes closer to midnight. Midnight is the end. It's now 3 minutes from midnight. That's the closest it's been in 30 years, since the early Reagan years when there was a major war scare.
Well, you mentioned obviously the US and Israel in terms of Iran. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu obviously doesn't want this nuclear deal to work at all, and he says...
And it's interesting, we should ask why.
Why?
We know why. Iran has very low military expenditures, even by the standards of the region, let alone the United States. Its strategic doctrine is defensive. It's designed to hold off an attack long enough for...
Hey, what's up everybody? I hope you're doing fine. This is your presenter, Critic Stories, and today we're going to be talking about something important that I think we need to address. Now, the United States have been always seen as one of the greatest countries. Well, I tried to look outside. Somebody called Noam Chomsky is a prominent linguistic, a philosopher, and a political critic who has described the United States as the biggest terrorist state due to its history of military intervention, covert operation, and foreign policies that, according to him, have violated international laws and caused massive suffering worldwide. And, you know, there's this picture that the United States have always been seen through the lenses of other people, like it's a great country, is a good country, doesn't involve itself in foreign policies and all that thing. But if you ask me as an African, I've seen the ants of the United States even in our own country here today. And I'm glad that we have a philosopher like Noam Chomsky who really says the truth and goes out and, you know, says how he thinks, and because it's at the end of the day, it's the truth. Because a lot of people could come out and name the atrocities, like what the United States have done to them, you know. And looking at the world, like everything which is happening today, and US-Russia relationships and everything which is happening today, there's a speculation that World War III might just, you know, start anytime soon. But we're going to be asking ourselves, who are the key drivers of all this happening? So I want you to buckle up for this video. It is a video by Noam Chomsky. Actually, he was being interviewed, and this is all he had to say, because he's saying that US is the world's biggest terrorist. And I'm also curious. I want to know, apart from the atrocities that the United States have done to other countries, what is it that this philosopher, a linguist, a political analyst, has to say also about this? So if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll most definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership. You can support me through my Cash App account. It's on my bio. I'll definitely appreciate. Go check me out, and you know, and I'll appreciate everything. So let's dive right to the video. As you always know, I'll be back with my commentary. You can like the video so that people are like-minded like you can get to see what these philosopher says about this video. See you after the video. I'll be giving you my 1, 2, 3 commentary and all I have to say about this. Until then, Yeah.
Diplomacy to set in. And the United States and Israel, the two rogue states, do not want to tolerate a deterrent. No strategic analyst with a brain functioning thinks that Iran could ever use a nuclear weapon. If it even prepared to do so, the country would simply be vaporized. And there's no indication that the ruling clerics, whatever you think about them, want to see everything they have destroyed.
Just one more question now on this issue, and this is from another member of our social media, and it's Morton A. Anderson, and he asks, do you believe that the US would ever strike a deal that would be dangerous to Israel in the first place?
The United States is carrying out constant actions which endanger Israel very seriously, namely supporting Israeli policy. For the last 40 years, the greatest threat to Israel has been its own policies. If you look back 40 years, say 1970, Israel was one of the most admired countries in the world, respected, admired, lots of favorable attitudes towards it. Now it's one of the most disliked and feared countries in the world. In the early 70s, Israel made a decision. They had a choice. They made a decision to prefer expansion to security. And that carries with it dangerous consequences. The consequences which were obvious at the time, I wrote about them, other people did. If you prefer expansion to security, it is going to lead to internal degeneration, anger, opposition, isolation, and possibly ultimate destruction. And by supporting those policies, the United States is contributing to the threats that Israel faces.
Well, then you see, that will bring me to the point of terrorism then, because that is really a global blight. And, some, and I think including yourself, will say that this is blowback for US terrorist policy around the world. How far is the US and its allies responsible for what we're seeing now in terms of the terrorist attacks around the world?
Remember, the worst terrorist campaign in the world right now, by far, is the one that's being orchestrated in Washington. That's the global assassination campaign. There's never been a terrorist campaign at that scale.
When you say global assassination campaign?
The drone campaign. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what it is. Over large parts of the world, the United States is systematically, publicly, openly, I'm just nothing secret about what I'm saying. We all know it. It's carrying out regular campaigns to assassinate people who the U.S. government suspects of intending to harm us someday. And indeed, it is, as you mentioned, a terror-generating campaign. When you bomb a village in Yemen, say, and you kill somebody, maybe the person you were aiming at, maybe not, and other people who were happen to be in the neighborhood, how do you think people react? They say, we're going to take revenge.
You describe the US as the leading terrorist state. Where does Europe fit into that picture then?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, for example, there was recently a study, I think it was done by the Open Society Forum, of the worst form of torture, rendition. Rendition means you take somebody you suspect of something and you send him off to your favorite dictator, maybe Assad or Gaddafi or Mubarak, to be tortured, and then hoping that maybe something will come out of it. That's extraordinary rendition. The study reviewed the countries that participated in it. Well, obviously the Middle East dictatorships, because that's where they were sent to be tortured. Europe, most of Europe participated. England, Sweden, other countries. In fact, there was only one region of the world where nobody participated, Latin America, which is very dramatic. First of all, Latin America has now gotten pretty much out of U.S. control. When it was controlled by the United States not very long ago, it was the world center of torture. Now it wouldn't participate. in the worst form of torture, rendition. Europe participated. If the master roars, the servants cower.
So Europe is the servant of the United States?
Evidently. They're too cowardly to take an independent position.
Where does Vladimir Putin fit into this picture? He's painted as, well, one of the greatest global threats to security. Is he?
Like most leaders, he's a threat to his own population. He's taken illegal actions, obviously, but to depict him as a crazed monster who's suffering from brain disease and has Alzheimer and is, a rat-faced evil creature, that's standard Orwellian fanaticism. I mean, whatever you think about his policies, they're understandable. The idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked?
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along, expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one, the parliament voted, I think 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.
Which you can understand why they would want to join NATO. You can see why Petro Poroshenko's government would probably see that it's protecting his country.
No, it's not protect. Crimea was taken away after the overthrow of the government, right? He's not protecting Ukraine, is threatening Ukraine with major war. That's not protection. The point is, this is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to. That's well understood.
If we look at the situation in Europe, though, there's also another interesting phenomenon that's taking place, because we're seeing Greece moving towards the east, potentially, with the Syriza government. We're also seeing Podemos, which is gaining power in Spain. Hungary also. Do you see that there is a potential for Europe to start shifting and aligning itself more with Russian interests in Europe?
Take a look at what's happening. Hungary is a different situation entirely. Syriza came into office on the basis of a popular wave which said that Greece should no longer subject itself to policies from Brussels and the German banks, which are destroying the country. I mean, the effect of these policies has been actually to increase Greece's debt relative to its wealth production. Probably half of younger people are unemployed. 40% of the population is under the poverty line. Greece is being destroyed.
Should their debt be written off?
Sure, just like Germany's was. In 1953, Europe wrote off most of Germany's debt, like that. So that Germany would be able to reconstruct from wartime damage.
But then what about all the other European countries that have been...
Same story.
So Portugal should have its debt written off, Spain have its debt written off.
Who is this debt? Who incurred this debt? And who is the debt owed to? The debt is mostly the response. In part, the debt was incurred by dictators. So in Greece, it's the fascist dictatorship, which the U.S. supported, that incurred a large part of the debt. The debt, I think, quadrupled under the dictatorship. That's what's called in international law odious debt, need not be paid. That's a principle introduced into international law by the United States when it was in their interest to do so. Much of the rest of the debt is the payments, what are called payments to Greece, are being paid mostly to banks. German and French banks, which had decided to make extremely risky loans at very high interest, and are now being faced with the fact that they can't be paid back.
Well, I'd like to bring this question then from Jill Gribaldo, who says, how will Europe transform then versus the existential challenges it's facing? Because yes, there's the economic crisis, but there's also a rise in nationalism. And he also describes the cultural fault lines which are beginning to be created across Europe. How do you see Europe transforming itself?
Well, Europe has serious problems. Part of the problems are the result of economic policies designed by the bureaucrats in Brussels, European Commission and so on, under the pressure mainly of the big banks, mostly German. Now, these policies make some sense from the point of view of the designers. For one thing, they want to be paid back for their risky and hazardous loans and investments. The other thing is that these policies are eroding the welfare state, which they've never liked. The welfare state is one of Europe's major contributions to modern society. The rich and powerful have never liked it, and in fact this is eroding it, so good from their point of view. There's another problem in Europe. It's extremely racist. I've always felt that Europe is probably more racist than the United States. It wasn't as visible in Europe because the European populations in the past tended to be pretty homogeneous. So if everybody is blonde and blue-eyed, you don't seem racist. But as soon as it begins to change, it comes out of the woodwork very fast. And that's a serious cultural problem in Europe.
I'd like to end, because we're very short of time, with a question maybe trying to end on a more positive note. And this is from Robert Light, and he says, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is a couple of things we've talked about. Latin American independence, for example. That's of historic significance. And we're going to see it right now in the Summit of America's meeting in Panama. In the recent hemispheric meetings, the United States has been completely isolated. It's a radical change from 10 or 20 years ago when the U.S. just ran it. In fact, the reason why Obama made his gestures towards Cuba is to try to overcome U.S. isolation. It's the U.S. that's isolated, not Cuba. Probably it'll fail, we'll see. The signs of optimism in Europe are Syriza and Podemos. There is finally a popular uprising against the crushing, destructive economic and social policies that come from the bureaucracy and the banks. And that's very hopeful, should spread.
Noam Chomsky, many thanks for being with me.
Yeah.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're fine. I hope you've heard the philosopher, the professor, the political analyst Noam Chomsky, a really important figure in our world today when it comes to geopolitics and everything that is happening around the world. Now, there are a couple of talking points that I really wanna say, because having looked at this online, I think it's important that we have to talk about this. And for me, as a young researcher, as a person who really likes to know what's happening around the world, geopolitics and everything, I would like to say that the United States has really done a lot, actually a lot of harm to the world as compared to good that it has done to the world. Now, I'm going to be looking at the historical moments, that the things that the United States have done. And so it might have aligned with what Noam Chomsky also said before in this video. So the first thing that I'm going to be talking about, and this is something which has been happening even in Africa, our country, I'm talking about military intervention. But since you and I know that even today, USA has its hand in our country, Kenya, I'm going to be talking about something that happened in the Vietnam around 1955 to 1975. Now, what's the view of Noam Chomsky in military intervention, according to what happened in the Vietnam War. That is in 1955 to 1975. That's around 20 years of Vietnam War. Now, Chomsky views the U.S. involvement in Vietnam as a textbook case of state terrorism. The use of chemical weapons like Agent Orange, bombing campaigns, and the devastation of civilian population. In his view, deliberate acts to maintain U.S. global dominance. Yes, it will always put its hands where you want a country that supports chaos for it to maintain its dominance. It has always been a murky game to the United States. There is nothing always fair with them. Now, also talking about military intervention, I'm also going to be talking about the Iraq War, which happened in the year 2003. Now, Noam Chomsky also describes the invasion of Iraq as illegal under international law, leading to deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians and destabilization of the Middle East. He highlights the use of false pretexts such as weapon of mass destruction to justify the war. Talking about drone strikes, this is something that US is also good at. Like, look at what's yet to happen between Russia and USA just recently. It's like things are just repeating themselves, right? Now, Chomsky criticizes the US reliance on drone strikes in countries like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, which have resulted in significant civilian casualties, describing these actions as extrajudicial killings. Now, the third thing that it has involved itself into is support for authoritarian regimes. Now, Chomsky points out that US support for dictators and regimes that commit atrocities as long as they align with American geopolitical interest. As I said, it is always a murky business. As long as this is something that will benefit them, they'll put their murky hands in it. And they've done this successfully, right? They have managed to manipulate other countries. I don't want to talk about what's happening between Palestine and Israeli, because it has put its hand in Israeli war, Palestinian war, and who are suffering are the civilians, right? So a true definition of who is a terrorist, you understand what I'm talking about. Now, support for authoritarian regimes. There are a couple of authoritarian regimes that I'm going to be talking about, like historically. Like, for example, the Pinochet in Chile, that's happened in 1973. The US supported Augusto Pinochet's coup, which led to decades of repression and violence. Also, Suharto in Indonesia. The US backed Suharto, whose regime was responsible for genocide in East Timor and political purges that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Same case to what's happening in Palestine. Same case to what happened in Somalia. Same case to what happened in the Middle East. Same case to what really, it keeps on, repeating the same thing. But does it care about the civilians? No, it doesn't care. Because at the end of the day, it's about business. It's about making money. It's about, and even the civilians, people in the United States are crying about this, are talking about this, and nobody's listening about them. I'm also going to be talking about covert operations. Chomsky highlights CIA interventions and operations as forms of state terrorism. Now, Iran, that's 1953. The CIA orchestrated a coup to overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized oil, leading to decades of authoritarian rule under the Shah. Central America, that's 1980s. The US supported Contra-rebel in Nicaragua, who were involved in massacres and human rights abuse. Chomsky cites this as a blatant example of funding and directing terrorism to achieve political goals. I'm also going to be talking about economic warfare. There are a lot of sanctions that the US is doing. Now, Chomsky views US as sanction on countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Iraq as form of terrorism. These sanctions, he argues, that disproportionately arm civilians by restricting access to food, medicine, and basic resources, effectively coercing governments into submission. It has successfully done this to a lot of countries. There are a lot of sanctions that it has done to Venezuela. I think the one that I know of, I haven't heard about Cuba, but this document highlights Cuba also as, yeah, and Iraq also. Also going to be talking about World Bank and IMF policies. The policies that these banks push are individualistic policies. They don't care about the country. Because just like 5 months ago, it is the IMF and the World Bank which were trying to push some policies here in Kenya, our country, and people are like fighting this. And the individualistic ideologies that they're always trying to pass, it's for their own benefit. There is always nothing fair for the US. It's always about them. They'll always make it that they are the ones to benefit out of everything that you're doing. Like there will always be nothing fair. There'll always be nothing like 50-50 between you and the USA. As long as you're having a contract, know that they are agreeing because they are going to benefit out of it. And like the policies that the IMF, the World Bank are trying to push, the policies that are trying to push, it brought a lot of chaos. Like in our country, like 5 months ago, you could see people on the street because of the policies that these few corporates were trying to push. What these elites were trying to push to us. But I thank God we fought it and we told them we know we can do better than what you're trying to offer us. Now, Noam Chomsky also talks about this, and he criticizes how the US uses global financial institutions to impose neoliberal policies that devastate economies in developing countries, exacerbating poverty and equality, just like what they were trying to do in our country. The sixth thing that I'm also going to be talking about is double standards in the international law. Chomsky argues that the US applies one set of rules for itself and another for other forms of nation. And I said, anything involving the US, it's always murky. The rule that applies to you doesn't apply to them. It's called the double standards that the US has. Now, the US invaded Iraq on the pretext of enforcing UN resolution, yet consistently vetoes resolution criticizing Israel's occupation of Palestine territories, right? So the rule that applies to you doesn't apply to them. Now, the US avoids accountability in international courts for its own action while demanding accountability for others. And I think a lot of scholars have talked about this. Like, a lot of scholars have talked about the accountability and the double standards that the United States has, And I think it is at the right time that people get to know that this is the true nature of, the United States. There are a lot of historical examples which are still ongoing, like bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's the 1945, which made an end to the Second World War. Chomsky sees the atomic bombing as acts of state terrorism, intended to intimidate the Soviet Union rather than to hasten the Japans to surrender. Now, they just chose to bomb them. They didn't find any way to make them, stop whatever they were trying to do. War on terror, that's post 9/11 policies, including indefinite detention of Guantanamo Bay and torture programs, which are cited as evidence of systemic abuses. Now, lastly, I would like to talk about Chomsky's core argument in regards to this. Now, Chomsky's main point is that US operates with impunity because of its global power and influence. Its actions, which will be condemned as a terrorism if carried out by weaker states, are legitimized through propaganda and media control. He argues that the re-examination of the US foreign policy and its long-term consequences for global stability. I would like to let me know what you think about this video. If you agree with what Noam Chomsky said about this, tell me in the comment section what you think about this. What's your experience as a person who is outside the United States with the US? You as a citizen of the United States also, what's your take on this? Let me meet you in my next video. As you always know, this is your presenter, Critic Stories. See you and peace out.